Hi, welcome back to Plants and Produce. My name's Andy and today we're going to talk about tomatoes or tomatoes. My assistant is at work today, so I have my lovely wife, so if this video doesn't come out so good, can't blame my daughter, can only blame my wife. So, tomatoes. Most of the tomatoes are in two different types. There's determinate and there's indeterminate. So a lot of people don't know that determinate are the type of tomatoes that you just grow and it grows into like a bush variety. It will get to a certain height and then it will just completely stop. And then it will just bear you fruit normally all in one go. Indeterminate tomatoes are ones that will just keep growing and growing and growing and until you tell them that it's time to stop. So the way I grow tomatoes is I fill a tray, as you've seen me done many times before. So while I'm filling this tray, the weather this week has been a typical Oklahoma week. So at the start of the week we ended up with about 40 as a high, and we also ended up with around between a dusting and an inch of snow. And then today is supposed to be in the high 90s, or low 90s, sorry. So it's going to get hot. So once I've filled the tray, I would just gently squish it down so I have an indentation across the lot. So what I'm going to plant today is some Mariglobe, which are just basically full-size tomatoes. What I will do is I will put a few in each individual one. Once it's done, I'll just put a light covering on top. And then a gentle watering. Now if I was growing these outside or growing these in normal, I would actually make sure these are completely soaked. But because I'm going to put these into my box, which is down here, which at the moment is full, and then I would just let that go away. So these are ones I planted probably 5 days ago now. They're still a little bit early for me to prick them out or to start them on, but I'll just start them on as it stands right now. See what I do. At this point I will use my smaller containers, and as you can see my compost is not wet, but it sticks together. So I'll prick a few of these out and put in here. And yes, Miss Judy Z, they are your okra that's growing after 4 or 5 days. So in a couple of weeks you should be able to have some of those. Because of the type of compost I'm actually using, it's nice and soft, and so the tomatoes fall apart from each other very easily without damaging the root system. Okay, I will carry on potting these up and then I will join you again in a minute. Okay, so I will finish potting these up later, but what I do is I let these grow to a certain height, about this big, and from that point on I would pot them on into individual pots. So they end up being potted on and growing like this. Now at times there's some that get away from me. Before I've got them sold, they're getting quite aggressive in some of these small or paper pots. So let me just find you one of those. So this is one that's in a paper pot and it's got away from me a little bit before I've repotted it. So rather than get this one sold immediately, I will leave this as a double and I will just pot it up into a much bigger pot. So I'm running shorter pots right now. So I will use up this one here, the last of the carrots in this pot. And if somebody tells you that you can't grow carrots in a pot, then you can. So for this one, I would actually fill it only a small amount in the bottom. Take off most of the paper pot. Take off the bottom leaves. And then sink it as deep as you possibly can. And there you have a very healthy tomato plant. Now, once I get them growing from this point onwards, and I go from this point to either I'm growing them in buckets or I'm growing them outside. So this is one that I potted on a few weeks back and is at the point now where it needs trimming back. So this is one that I potted up about 5 weeks ago now, that got a bit big. I've been feeding it on a regular basis, but it's at the point where it needs to be trimmed back a bit to get some airflow. So most of the tomatoes that I'm going to grow in my greenhouse, and I'll go through that in a minute with you, I would strip down pretty consistently. But this one here depends on whether I want it to grow around a greenhouse or whether I want it to just become a big bushy plant. If I want it to become a big bushy plant, then I would just basically leave it as it is. If I want it to just grow continually, I would go up these stems and I would look for anything like this that's growing in between, and I would just pinch it out. Same on this one, pinch it out here. So it just continues up here, even though it seems, let me put it down on a little bit lower. So same on this one here, even though these are some really good stalks on the top, I would take those out and it will continue to grow upwards until it decides it's not going to. Now while I'm here on here, and then along the bottom, I would take off the bottom leaves to give some airflow around the bottom of the plant to reduce any diseases. So while I'm here on these flowers, and this is a full-size tomato, most of these flowers are all self-setting, but if you want to set a lot quicker, then just brush your hand over them. Now if they're outside and they're in the wind, you shouldn't have to do that, but if you do that, then they will set an awful lot quicker. So this is a tomato that I'll probably end up selling or planting outside at some point, as I already have plenty of tomatoes growing in the greenhouse. So to get strong tomatoes, what I do is I just run a fan across the top of them and then that way they're constantly moving and their stalks would be a lot stronger than what they would be usually. So this is how we start with the tomato, the one I showed you a minute ago, and then once I've trimmed it back, all the bottom leaves, it looks pretty bare, but I've trimmed it all the way back, left the tomatoes on it, and then as you get higher it's got all the leaves on it. So as a reference to my daughter, when she trimmed it back, yes, you are supposed to trim it back, but you're supposed to trim it back so you leave plenty of leaves for it to continue growing, but you want it to focus on making the tomatoes red. So as a side note, for my other daughter, yes, and she is the Dr. Death of plants, I do have one of your type of plants just for you, which I left out in the cold the other night, and I did this. Now I did this with the frost killed it. I didn't do it like the way you did it. So my other tomatoes that I've trained to grow have started down the bottom, have grown up. I've trained them to go down here, leaving the bunches of tomatoes as I go, and then continued to let them grow, plenty of leaves, and then they're growing all the way up there. This one here, very similar. I've already harvested the tomatoes off it, and now it's going and continue going all the way up to the top here. So that's how I grow tomatoes. It's not necessarily the best way, but it's the way that works for me. So one other minor thing for my grandchild, or one of my grandchildren, Zane. This tomato here is ready to eat. This tomato here is not. So only pick the red ones. So as I've said before, it depends on whether you have a determinate tomato or an interdeterminate tomato. Determinate tomatoes will grow all the way through the season up to about 6 months, and you will continually get tomatoes off them. Cherry tomatoes particularly are in abundance. Full-size tomatoes you won't get quite as many, but there's an awful lot more determinate full-size tomatoes than there is cherry tomatoes. So I'm going to sign off this one as it's already 95 degrees in here, so it's getting a little warm.